Today, we are going to look at a case from the 1920s. So sit back as we go to England. John Norman Holmes Thorne, known as Norman by his friends and family, was born in 1900. He lived with his parents in Kensal Green, which is in the northwest part of London, and worked as an engineer. In 1920, Norman met a young lady named Elsie Cameron. She was a typist and worked locally. Elsie was 2 years older than Norman and worried a lot. When they met, she was 22 years old and concerned that she was not yet married. Many of her friends had already married, as the average age for women to marry in 1920s Britain was 21. But she had a boyfriend, and she hoped that soon he would propose to her. In 1921, the British economy was not doing as well as it had in the previous 2 years, and unemployment had risen sharply. Unfortunately for Norman, like many other young men, he lost his job. He did his best to find another one, but competition was tough, so after a few unsuccessful attempts to find work, he decided to start his own business. His business idea, however, was very different to working in the big city. Norman planned to move to the small town of Crowborough, a picturesque place set in the East Sussex countryside, about 50 miles south of central London. With a population of around 6,000, it was a far cry from the hustle and bustle of life in the capital. His father gave him £100, and he managed to purchase a small piece of land in the Sussex countryside and started a chicken farm. He decided to trade under the name Wesley Poultry Farm. Norman was a hard worker. He built himself a little hut to live in. It was very basic and a somewhat primitive way to live, but he was keen to build up his business. As well as his own accommodation, he also built sheds and chicken runs, and then purchased the chickens for his business. It was a hard but also an idyllic lifestyle, and the business was able to give him an income. When he could, at weekends, Norman would cycle back to London to see his family and his girlfriend Elsie. Cycling 50 miles each way at the weekends and working all week was difficult, even for a fit young man like Norman. And as the business grew, he needed to work more at the weekends. So Elsie started to visit him a couple of weekends a month. She would catch the train from London to Crowborough and spend the day helping Norman, and at night she would lodge with Norman's neighbours named Mr. and Mrs. Cosham. The relationship seemed to be going well, and the couple became engaged at Christmas 1922. Elsie was really happy. But in early 1923 she lost her job. This was a big issue for the couple, as they needed money to get married. Fortunately for Elsie, in the early 1920s, typists were in demand, but she suffered from muscular aches, tension and headaches, meaning she had time off work and would leave one job to recover before starting another. It was going to take a long time for them to save the money for a wedding and a place to live, as they could not start married life in the small hut on the chicken farm. But Elsie really wanted to get married and settle down. The couple continued to see each other most weekends, but by mid-1923, the chicken farm wasn't doing very well, and Norman's income was going down. He was very concerned about his business, and at the same time, Elsie would keep asking him to set a date for the wedding. She was now 25 years old, and most of her friends were married and had children. Norman, however, was very reluctant to get married, telling his fiancée that he wanted to wait until their prospects improved. Things just carried on the same until June 1924, when Norman went out to a local dance. While there, he met a young lady named Elizabeth Ann Caldecott, known by her family and friends as Bessie. She was a local girl who worked as a dressmaker. She was different to Elsie. She was more easygoing, always smiling, and seemed to be less intense than Norman's fiancée. He started to see her after work, while Elsie was in London. In October, Elsie travelled to Crowborough. She stayed with Mr. and Mrs. Cosham, but spent the days with Norman, working on the chicken farm. Norman didn't tell her about Bessie, but she again asked him to set a date for the wedding, and he continued to be very evasive in his answers. Norman knew that he could not continue to deceive his fiancée and had to tell her that he had met someone else. So in November he wrote to Elsie and told her about Bessie. He thought that he was breaking off the engagement, but Elsie didn't see it that way and wrote back saying that they should marry as soon as possible. Norman wrote to her again, explaining that he had met someone else, but Elsie was not going to throw away the previous 4 years of her life, so she wrote back to Norman, telling him that they must marry because she was pregnant. Elsie was getting increasingly more anxious. She was angry with Norman. He was aware of her health issues, and when he tried to break off their engagement, she decided to go and see him. So on Sunday the 30th of November, she got on a train to Crowborough and without telling Norman, went to the farm. Norman was very surprised to see her and not altogether pleased. She was very upset and agitated, and in an attempt to calm her down, he told her that he would name the date for their wedding after he had spoken to his father. Norman's father came to the farm to visit his son on Wednesday, December the 3rd, and Norman told him of his poor financial circumstances and about his fiancée being pregnant. Mr. Thorne was sceptical of Elsie's claim. He was aware that she wanted to settle down, but thought that maybe the pregnancy claim was just a desperate attempt to finally get married. He advised his son not to rush into anything. Norman took his father's advice and wrote to Elsie, telling her of his father's concerns and explaining that he did not want to rush into marriage. Elsie was distraught. She had been waiting more than 4 years to get married, and she started to think that it was never going to happen. On the 5th of December 1924, agitated, angry and fragile, and clinging desperately onto the hope that Norman would marry her, Elsie went to the train station and bought a third-class ticket to Crowborough, and then she disappeared. A few days passed, and her parents became concerned about their daughter's well-being. On December the 10th, her father sent a telegram to Norman asking for news of his daughter. Norman replied straight away, saying that he had not seen her. Elsie's father immediately informed the police that his daughter was missing. The police in Crowborough started to look for Elsie and started to speak to the local people. With a population of only 6,000, it did not take long before they established that 2 farm workers had in fact seen Elsie on the 5th of December walking towards the farm with an attaché case in hand. The police were not convinced about their story and thought that they could have been mistaken. Norman had said that he hadn't seen her, so the police presumed that the 26-year-old Elsie had just gone away. Christmas and New Year came and went, and there was still no sign of Elsie. Trying to trace her movements from the train station to the farm, the police visited a neighbour of Norman's named Mrs. Anne Price. She told the police that she was certain that she had seen Elsie go to the farm on the 5th of December. This was very significant, as it meant that the statement from the 2 farm workers was probably correct, as 3 witnesses had now seen her on the day that she disappeared. Sussex police thought that they may have a very serious investigation on their hands and asked Scotland Yard to assist them. Chief Inspector Gillan arrived and assumed command of the inquiry. Inspector Gillan immediately brought Norman to the police station to be questioned and obtained a warrant to search the farm. The comprehensive search found some of Elsie's possessions in a tin. These included a bracelet, a watch and jewellery. The next day they arrived with spades and started to dig. They soon came across Elsie's attaché case, which contained her clothes. Inspector Gillan told Norman what the police had uncovered. Norman knew that his original statement, claiming that he hadn't seen his fiancée, was starting to unravel, so he changed his story. He then gave the police a macabre account of what had happened on the night of the 5th of December 1924. He told the inspector that Elsie had arrived on the farm unannounced. She was upset and agitated, and told him that she was staying with him on the farm until they were married. He explained to her that financially that was not possible, and that now he had another girlfriend and no longer wanted to be with her. They argued, and Elsie didn't accept the situation. Later he told her that he had an unavoidable appointment and had to go out for a few hours. He did not tell her where he was going, as he was going to meet Bessie and her mother. He returned at about 11:30 p.m, and when he opened the door of the hut, he saw something terrible, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, hanging from the beam in his room, was Elsie. She had hanged herself using the washing line cord. Norman cut her down and laid her on the bed, thinking about what he should do. Should he fetch the doctor to issue a death certificate or tell the police? But everyone knew that he was seeing Bessie whilst being engaged to Elsie, and people might say that he was responsible for her death. Norman then decided to do something quite bizarre. He fetched his hacksaw and sawed off Elsie's legs and head. He put her body parts in sacks and buried them under one of the chicken runs. The mystery of what had happened to Elsie Cameron had now been solved. But how she actually died had not. Nevertheless, Inspector Gillen charged Norman Thorne with her murder. The case sparked nationwide interest, and journalists and photographers swarmed down to the peaceful little country town. Norman was taken to Brixton Prison to await trial. The trial took place in the East Sussex town of Lewes on the 4th of March 1925. Norman's defence strategy was that Elsie Cameron had committed suicide, and his crime was the dissection and concealment of the body. The defence claimed that this was due to the overwhelming fear of being accused of killing her. They also told the court that Elsie was neurotic and often depressed. They said that she was sometimes hysterical and suffered from nervous disorders. For the first 6 months of 1924, she had been constantly under medical supervision. They told the court that the defendant, Norman Thorpe, was innocent. The Crown pointed to the facts that the beam had no marks on it, and when they conducted experiments with weights hanging from a beam, the Crown put it that there was no possible way that any weights had swung from the beam on the farm. They also pointed to the fact that there were no scars around the neck of the deceased. When Norman took the stand, the prosecution asked him a series of questions, and he eventually admitted that he preferred Bessie to Elsie, and that he had not tried to resuscitate Elsie when he found her. The prosecution told the court that Norman had killed his fiancée as he wanted to be with Bessie, and the suicide story was completely untrue. After 5 days, the jury retired to deliberate, but it only took 30 minutes to return with a verdict of guilty. Norman Thorne was sentenced to death. Norman maintained his innocence and never admitted to the crime, and many people considered him to be innocent. But he had been found guilty and was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the 22nd of April 1925. Strangely enough, the day he was hanged would have been Elsie's 27th birthday. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you might have, and I will see you in the next brief case.